have risen. It was a little over $6.5 billion for full year of 2018, and that's an increase of about 25%. If you look back at, let's say, 2011, the premium level was about $5.2 billion. So we look at that, and getting to those numbers, we aggregate the premium numbers that companies file in the directors and officers supplement, insurance supplement, that's in the annual NAIC statement. So we look at that, and even for the 2019 period, we've looked at the quarterly numbers or the quarterly premiums that we've aggregated, and our anticipation for year-end 2019 is that when everything's said and done, when we've calculated everything, that we'll see at least at 10+% increase from premium standpoint, maybe up to around 7.2 billion or a little more. So we'll see where we end up with that, but that's marketplace is probably a little over $7 billion.
And what are you seeing in terms of the direct loss ratio?
Well, I think over the last several years, what we've seen is, and again, we talk about the need for more rate adequacy, and the reason that obviously comes into play is because, as I mentioned earlier, results have been deteriorating. So we've seen the loss and defense cost containment, loss adjustment expense that's allocated to claims. We've seen that rise fairly consistently over the last several years, and I think, again, we'll talk about a number of the reasons why during the webinar. But I think we've seen a relatively consistent rise in the loss ratio. So again, deteriorating underwriting profitability. The question is, with the pretty aggressive pricing measures that companies have taken the last 2 years, let's say the last 3 quarters of 2018 and full 2019, we're going to see at the end of this year what kind of a dent or what kind of an impact that might have had on the underwriting profitability. But from loss ratio standpoint, we've seen a consistent upward trend, deterioration in terms of underwriting profitability.
So, Sridhar, who are the biggest writers of D&O insurance?
Yeah, before we get to that, I'd really like to add to what David had mentioned in terms of loss ratios. The loss ratios and the defense cost containment ratios that we have for 2019 are essentially an estimate. And what we have seen over the years is the defense cost containment expense ratio has increased from 8.7 million in 2011 by more than 70% to 14.8 million in 2017, an increase from close to 9% of the premiums to almost 15% in 2017. And we feel that this is a secular trend because I know that we are going to discuss more about this, but the Cyan versus Beaver has really set a precedent where there is going to be a number of concurrent filings in the state and federal court. I follow a website called the DNOdiary.com, and there was a mention, I read it pretty regularly, carefully, so there was a mention about a IPO for Smile Dental, which does alignments. It's not a high-tech company, it's not a biotech company, but still, when it went IPO, now they are facing lawsuits in Tennessee, Michigan, New York, and at the federal level. So where it used to be one court case that they had to defend, now they have to pay defense containment costs across 4 jurisdictions. Now, forget about the merits of the case, but just the defense containment costs have really increased a lot. So coming back to what was your question again? Sorry.
Before we get too far, we have an exhibit on that, Exhibit 3. Would you want to speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was the Exhibit 3 on the defense and cost containment expense ratio that we were talking about, how it has returned from, how it has increased from 8.7 to 14.8, a 70% increase in the DCC to direct earned premium ratios, almost a 70% increase in the contribution of the expense ratios. And this is going to be a secular trend. It's going to continue. And it's how the insurers are going to deal with it in terms of underwriting is key. So, again, the question was about, your initial question was about?
Who are the biggest writers?
Oh, yes. Yeah, thank you. So I think if you look at the biggest writers, they go back and forth. I mean, in terms of the actual number 1, number 2, number 3, etc. But in this particular